Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody. This is Howard Fox, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Howard Rankin. Dr. Rankin is the author of I Think, Therefore I Am Wrong, A Guide to Bias, Political Correctness, Fake News, and the Future of Mankind. He received his doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of London. He is also a fellow podcaster. Howard hosts the How Not to Think podcast. Dr. Howard Rankin, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you, Howard. I like your name, by the way.
You know, I never liked Howard as I was growing up, and I don't know why that was the case, but as I have gotten older, I appreciate there's something strong about the word Howard.
Yes,
And
let's hope so.
Yes, and you and I have very powerful presence, and that's a good thing. And on that note, tell us a little bit about your background, some of the work that you have been doing, and how did we get to where we are today?
Yeah, good question. Well, some of the listeners might recognize that my accent's a little different. Yeah,
that's like
England.
Jersey.
Yeah, I come from England originally. I've been in the US for more than 30 years, so the accent's kind of just off the coast of North Carolina or South Carolina right now. And had a long career in psychology as a psychologist, did a number of things, started off in the addictions, and specifically behavior change. Then more recently, or towards the end of my psychology career, because I now do other things, I really got into the neuroscience and how the brain works. And I think that's actually very, very important. And then I got interested into what's called cognitive neuroscience, or how we really think, and the biases that we employ basically to justify any position we want. Mark Twain said, first get the facts, then spin them as you please, or something like that. And that's what we do. Human beings in many ways are not rational. As I wrote in one book, human beings are not logical, they're psychological, often with the emphasis on the psycho.
Oh, God.
We use biases to justify ourselves. And in these days of technology, we see that it seems to me that's getting worse and worse and worse. And that leads to the sort of extremism and divide that we see in society. And so this is more than just having your own opinion. It's, are we moving away into a very divisive culture?
It's interesting that you asked the question, are we moving into a more divisive culture? There is just so much noise out there. You and I are, for the sake of better words, we're solo entrepreneurs. We happen to have some very specific skills. You're bringing a lot of your psychological background into your profession and working with people and groups. And then for my coaching practice, but there's just so much noise. We're just constantly bombarded with it. And then how do we make sense of all of that noise? So when you say things are just getting worse and worse, I mean, how do we change that? I don't know.
Well, that's sort of the $64,000 or even $64 million question. That is a problem. And the problem is this, that when you're dealing with trivial things, you don't need to do a huge deep dive into, the complexity of it. If it's, where are we going for dinner tonight? You don't have to think of 30 variables to work out where you're going. So that's not necessary. But then there are some issues in life, actually some very important ones, like choice of career or spouse or big issues related to politics or whatever, where you really have to get away from this sort of simple-minded first emotional reaction and do what I call a deep dive into the problem. Because life is so complex, if you're just going to skim off the surface of it, you're going to be wrong. There's in my book, I quote a British statistician called George Box, who, talking about scientific models, said, all models are wrong, some are useful. And I think of thinking and ideas and thoughts the same way. They're all wrong in some way. They're not perfect. And some of them are totally useless, but some have value. And that complexity is very difficult for a lot of people to grab. it needs a certain amount of training, and it also needs a certain amount of training of your brain to be able to do that.
I would also add a little bit of desire. I have to want to be trained to
absolutely
learn how to think. I'd love to get into the book, but there's a question I have. As you have transitioned your career, is your vocation today, is it revolving around the writing, the podcasting, perhaps speaking? Are you coaching individuals, teams? How are you putting this interest of yours into the neuroscience, the cognitive neuroscience, into practice today for the people whose lives you are engaging with?
Right. Well, it manifests in different ways. It's the same sort of issue and same sort of topic, but it manifests in different ways. So I do some coaching, and I do some corporate coaching, because this is very important in establishing the right culture. When we talk about teamwork, for example, you've got to create the right culture, which is respect everybody, make people feel safe, they can be creative as they want, recognize there's no brilliant idea, and work together to sculpt a variety of ideas. If you don't have that culture, you're going to be wasting a lot of your time. So I do a little bit of that at a corporate level and speaking about these things, and of course, writing about them. I'm also involved in something called the Healthy Minds Initiative, which is the brainchild of two awesome neurologists, Dean and Ayesha Sherzai, who wrote the book, The Alzheimer's Solution, which basically says Alzheimer's and dementia, which is, a tremendous issue and is going to get even worse, is really a function of lifestyle, not really genetics. It's lifestyle, it's nutrition, it's exercise, it's all of those. It's the right stimulation. And I'm heavily involved in that because that's really about brain health and brain training, and really speaks to this issue too of how do we think? How do we train people to think? How do we teach kids to think? Because that is, for me, important. If we carry on the way we are right now, I don't see how we're ever going to have a sensible discussion about anything. And that, to me, is very scary.
That's extremely scary, because all around us, people are making split-second decisions without having all the information they need to make I don't know if it's an informed decision, informed choice, but they just not a lot of evidence. They just react.
And part of this is the sort of conflation of, rights and being right. Just because you have a right to an opinion doesn't make it right. It certainly doesn't make it a fact. And this notion that somehow if somebody challenges your opinion, that you're offended. And one of the worst, I have to say, one of the worst and most damaging psychological sort of pop psych myths is perception is reality.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Now, reality, in that makes, well, wait a minute, my reality is my reality. But the point is, reality as a definition is a consensus about what the truth is. So you can't have an individual reality. You can have a version of your reality. And no one's denying what you think and feel. But that's not reality. And so that myth has really led to people, well, this is my reality, this is right, I'm entitled to it, which are all sorts of different questions involved in that. But that gets to the point that anything that I say or think is right, and if you argue against me, you're an idiot, I'm wrong, and I'm offended. And we can't carry on like that.
No, and that's what we're inundated with day in, day out. Which for people like me, it's just like, no, don't go on Facebook, don't go on Twitter. And it's because it's just everybody's yelling at you, even if it's words. Before we talk about the book, this Alzheimer's organization that you're affiliated with, I want to just, if you wouldn't mind, Howard, just give us another introduction to it, because I want to make sure for our listeners, if they'd like to learn more about the organization and perhaps to get involved.
So there is a website called healthymindsinitiative.org, and there you'll see a website devoted to this. What the Sherzais originally did was they would go into selected communities and try to educate them and then talk about what the communities could do to improve brain health. And that might be, increasing exercise facilities or putting brain healthy menus at restaurants, stuff like that. And they done that in a number of communities, but then they decided to really put this online in a huge way. And what's coming is amazing. You're onto something when Bill Gates writes to you and says, please submit a grant application to my foundation. And what's coming is going to be really amazing. It's going to be online, so communities and individuals will be able to get absolutely information, tools, assessments that will really help them in their brain health.
Fantastic. And we will most definitely put a link in our show notes back to the healthymindinitiative.org. Let's talk a little bit about your book. I think, therefore, I am wrong, a guide to bias, political correctness, fake news, and the future of mankind. Up until about 3.5 years ago, maybe, I had never heard the term fake news. Perhaps I did. It wasn't on my radar, but it's so easily thrown out today, especially when I don't believe what that party is saying. I have my version of the reality. Therefore, anything else that is not my reality becomes fake news. So your book is very timely. So talk about the book. What was the compelling reason, need that, and you are a prolific writer. I mean, anybody could go out to your website and you tell stories about how you got into writing and your use of limericks, et cetera, and humor. I love that. But some people just can sit down and write a book, and I suspect you've become very good at it. So talk about the book.
Well, as I was getting into the cognitive neuroscience, and that actually involved learning how to do neurofeedback and getting neurotechnology, ways to measure the brain and exactly what's going on in the brain. I got interested in all aspects of this, but again, the bias thing was so interesting to me because it seemed to be all around. I could see where I had done exactly the same thing. And you can see it all around, confirmation bias. You look for the things you want to look for and you ignore the things you don't, and you blame them as fake news or whatever, you blow them off. One of the things about technology is you can always find somebody on Facebook who's going to agree with you. And so that social proof kicks in. And I think that has really allowed people to say and do anything they want and believe it and feel reinforced for it when it's either irrelevant or completely wrong. And to me, that is fascinating insight into human behavior.
There was a Facebook comic not too long ago, and I will likely mess it up, but I think the overall idea was, in the days when we just had newspapers and this internet was becoming available, oh my God, I am going to be so much smarter because I have all of this information. Now that we have all this information, I guess I would question how much smarter are we actually?
Right. Well, the exposure to unlimited information, again, simply allows the sort of default process for you to pick what you want to believe and find the evidence for it. So it hasn't made people smarter. It's just given them a whole lot more information to continue to be biased in their thinking. And what we haven't done is really educate people in how to appreciate, understand, evaluate all sorts of things, from Facebook posts to op-eds to whatever you see, the ability to actually stand back a little bit from it and then say, wait a minute, let me ask some critical questions about this. And that's what's missing.
How do we change what we have been doing and embrace this path of critical evaluation, stepping back, appreciating, understanding? How do we do that?
It's an interesting question. Early in my career, in fact, one of my experiments for my Ph.D. was about developing self-control. Actually, in alcoholics, not sure you could do this study today, but actually what I did was working with impatient alcoholics and actually had them sit in front of some alcohol for a while and asked them to resist it on the assumption that the more they were able to resist it, it would develop their self-control. And there's some decent evidence for that. And a lot of people today kind of poo-poo self-control, and it's not about that, but that's exactly what it's about. And it's interesting in researching, I think, therefore I'm wrong. I asked the question, all the wise people of the past have said that virtue is the basis of wisdom. Being a good person, being forgiving, having gratitude, being compassionate, that's a hallmark of a good person. And it turns out there's now neuroscience evidence to show that people who practice those behaviors actually do develop the prefrontal cortex, the areas of the brain that you need to stop reacting impulsively, to be able to stand back and look at what you're thinking and evaluate it critically. So not only is it training in doing that, I think it's also training in virtues. Because if you think about the virtues, they are all about, or a good quote from Warren, which is, humility isn't thinking of yourself less, it's thinking less of yourself. And so all of those values are really about putting yourself second and not looking at it just from a selfish viewpoint. And that's exactly what you have to do to be able to develop this sort of mindfulness and control. So that certainly would be one thing. Teaching mindfulness, I think, would be good. And I think that should be taught in schools. And again, training in critical thinking. I think those are all ways we know what needs to be done. We just have to do it.
Very interesting. And with this book, are there guides or lessons, activities for the individual, for the team?
Yes. So I talk about that. So how do you develop these? And so I talk about 20 values that I talk about in the book that seem to be related to being able to let go of yourself and stand back. So I talk about those and ask the question, how can you become more of these things? How can you be more altruistic? Can you be more compassionate? So I talk about that. I talk about mindfulness exercises that I think are important. I talk about education. This is interesting. There was a social media post going around a while ago from an elementary school teacher who said, I was really shocked the other day when a parent of one of my students came in and said, I'm just not interested in how she's doing academically. Tell me in the classroom, is she kind? Is she forgiving? Now, that's one wise woman, because in the context of thinking, education, altruism is more important than algebra, compassion is more important than chemistry, and gratitude is more important than geography. And so we have to think about the big picture. We dive so much into the small details. We've got to train this person so that they can be a good what have you. Well, frankly, the best training is to develop that prefrontal cortex. And one way of doing that is through these sorts of things. And one path to that is indeed being a kind, compassionate, grateful, forgiving person. All of those virtues and values allow you to put yourself second and stand back, which is exactly what we're doing. We're not having an impulsive response like we see pretty much all the time in the media.
It's interesting when you provided that example with the parent coming in to talk to the teacher. Howard, many of my guests on the podcast are children's book authors. And one thing that is really becoming very clear to me, there's a growing amount of evidence. So I'm noticing in the conversation what the books are about, the message that's being conveyed. And one thing I'm learning is that many of the lessons in these children's books, number one, it's great for the children. It would be even better for the adult to learn those lessons, and that the lesson should be learned as early as possible with the child and the parents, because they're both on a learning journey. And so you don't take this book and start, okay, I'm going to read the book to my 4-year-old kid. I'm going to start reading to my child day one. This number of my authors who have appeared have had books about my child has anxiety, my child has had a visual defect, had to wear a patch, my child is short statured and there's bullying. My child is visually impaired. And the sooner we can teach kids about that, being showing gratitude, being in the moment, caring about others. It's not like we do things willfully. I'm going to be a bad person today. We just need to learn how to be a good person in the moment and remind yourself it's not just about me, but it's about others around me and how can I be helpful and show kindness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did a podcast recently about bullying with an Israeli expert who has a really interesting spin on it, that the strategies that have been used to try to prevent it are actually making it worse. What you should be doing is empowering the people who are being bullied, not say, oh, we're going to take care of it for you. And that's a whole other issue. I do believe that, of course, some people have been through horrendous stuff and there are quotation mark victims of all sorts of things. But I do think labeling yourself or anyone a victim is doing them no service whatsoever. Much prefer the word survivor. And there's some amazing work. I'm doing a book with a military physical therapist in Germany who had to devise a program for American combat soldiers who are horrendously injured during the Afghanistan and Iraq situations. And he had to devise a program that was opposite to what medical professionals have to do, which is, it's okay, you need to rest, what have you. These guys didn't want to be discharged. They wanted to go back to the front lines. And so he devised a program that pushed them as hard as possible to breaking point. And guess what? A lot of them made unbelievable, miraculous recoveries.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. It is amazing. The stories are incredible. They will not. Some of them just couldn't do it. And okay, you have to be discharged. But some amazing stuff. People without spines, back running. People with horrendous spine injuries, back jumping out of planes into combat. And what he showed, that if you tell your brain, you can deal with it. It's a little painful and you can deal with it. You just move, you'll be fine. If you tell your brain, oh my gosh, I've got so much pain, that's what it'll deliver. And so he's devised this program. The book, when it comes out later this year, is going to be pretty amazing because it's not just about pain. It's really about that success psychology. If you believe you can do it and you're going to do it, that's what will happen.
Wow.
And it has so many implications.
I would love to have that author on the podcast. So
we'll make sure he gets on because his stories are incredible.
Thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about the podcast. You and I met through Spot a Guest. For our listeners, there's probably close to 3,000 members now. It's podcast hosts like Howard and myself. And there's also guests can register as well who are looking to be on podcasts. And so as the group started to blossom, you get into conversations, and that's how we met. And so this is how we're having our conversation today. So let's talk a little bit about your podcast, How Not to Think. And what was the drive to say, I want to do a podcast? Or, what was that little spark for you?
Well, I had been doing a show on UK Health Radio with a co-host, Leah Manson, who's a coach in Canada and a very positive, delightful lady. We've been doing that for about 3 or 4 years, called Master Your Life. But as I was writing this book, I was getting more and more involved in that topic. And I decided I really wanted to have another venue to talk about it. And so in fact, at one point I thought of calling the book How Not to Think. But in the end, that's the name of the podcast. And really what it is looking for guests who aren't, do look beyond the normal parameters of thinking, are able to think critically, do question everything, do recognize that their ideas are probably wrong, but they may have some usefulness. That has had people who've done that have had amazing success. Not easy to do, but people have done it. And that's really what the podcast is about. Some of the tools we talked about earlier, whether we're talking about virtues or mindfulness or meditation, we've got some of that in there too.
Fantastic. I think I've had a couple guests that could be good guests for you as well. I had a gentleman, for the life of me, Ralph, was his name, has a Ph.D. in physics, is as he would call himself, a climate skeptic. So whether you are agreeing with climate change or not, it was an interesting conversation because he was concerned with the data, collecting data and doing analysis of the data. So having said all that, yeah, Ralph would be a good guest for you. So
Okay.
let me see if I can make that introduction if that's
Yeah,
one you would like.
That's great. That's exactly the sort of thing. And on the topic where, again, the sort of automatic reaction and bias kicks in a very, very complex way, and you see this all the time. And I mentioned this example in my book. Oh, it's 43 degrees today when it should be 58. Oh, so much for global warming. Come on, that's no evidence against global warming. Global warming doesn't mean that I'm going to be a few colder days, And then reverse. Oh my gosh, it's 97. This global warming must be true. No, it doesn't prove anything. That's the sort of irrelevant but widespread thinking that goes on and just confuses the whole issue.
Yeah, and I think it's bad enough that we're just presented with, again, for the sake of a better word, and perhaps I'm showing my bias, noise. The media, whoever they may be, are not even doing the service that they ought to be performing because it's all couched around, in many cases, profit and ratings, and so you have to find ways to avenues to gather fact that you can say, I can rely on this and it's informing my thoughts. So,
absolutely. And we do live in a culture where, media and advertising, a lot of it is simply about emotional manipulation.
Yeah.
And as you say, for ratings and profits. And, that is, to say, at least is a shame, if not a crime. How do you change that? That's the big question. And, I'm doing my little bit, at least to make people more aware of some of the things they can do and at least the nature of the problem.
You may not solve the problem, but you're certainly not abandoning it, and you're doing your bit. It dawns on me too, this past week or yesterday and the Sunday, we have two major events. We had a kickoff of the election season with the Iowa caucus, and there was major upheaval there in terms of people getting into their caucusing and then being able to record the data to decide who the winner is going to be. And then over the weekend, we had the Super Bowl. Now, I am a Detroit Lions fan. I have no idea what a Super Bowl is. I guess couple teams are playing. And apparently it was a good game, but there was so much controversy about the halftime with, I guess it was Jennifer Lopez and a woman named Shakira.
Yeah.
And oh my God, the conversations that are going on right now. And it's like, what does this topic of yours say about? So I'll tell you what, you pick which one you want to talk about.
I want to talk about Super Bowl 54.
Okay.
Yeah, they're calling it Super Bowl 54
Super
because
Bowl
I've been
54.
following this debate and even starting to write a little bit about it.
Okay.
And so there's been controversy, as you know. Some people say that was not appropriate. Some people are saying, get a life, you don't have to watch if you don't want to. And the arguments that I've seen in favor of it is, they were in great shape. They're going to encourage older people to exercise. The show was awesome, blah, blah, blah. That may be so, but that is not relevant. That's not relevant. The question is, and we have to be smart enough to ask the question is, how appropriate was the show? Not how good was it, not what you thought about. How appropriate is that for a major sporting event at halftime when there's a decent chance there's going to be a lot of kids, young teenagers watching that? How appropriate is that? That's the question. I'm not answering it. First of all, you got to say that question. So, if you like J-Lo and Shakira, that doesn't answer the question.
Is that really the question, though? I mean, is just to kind of push back just a little bit, because I don't know. I did not watch it. I may eventually see it on YouTube. But is that the only question?
No, I don't think it is. I think it spawns a variety of other questions.
Okay.
So that if you're going to have, for example, if you're going to have somewhat questionable, suggestive stuff at halftime, should there be some sort of rating of the halftime show that there is of movies to alert parents who are watching that may not be appropriate for their 8-year-old? You know, that it's appropriate. I don't know, but if you ask, is it appropriate? That, I think, is a good place to start. So it's not about, was it a good show? Was it great? Are they awesome? Don't they look fat? It's nothing to do with it. It's really, is this appropriate given that there is going to be a certain amount of kids watching? That's the question. And the discussion should be about that.
Okay.
You know?
Fair enough.
And you know, one thing is the game kicked off at 6:30. So first half went very quickly. So the halftime show was on at 8:15. A lot of kids are still up at 8:15.
Yeah, it's prime time.
If you kick off at 8:30 and the show's on at 10:30, then, you know, again, maybe there's differences. But if you ask one question, not open it up to everyone's opinion, and that might not be the question, but it's certainly a relevant question, how appropriate it is, then you channel, hopefully, the thinking about that to that question, and that raises some of the issues that I talked about. But again, you go on social media and you get all these things that are people's opinions, and that's great, and they're entitled to it, but they're really not relevant to a meaningful discussion of, should this be shown at that time when kids are watching?
You know, it dawns on me that the question that you've asked, is this appropriate? It can be applied to a lot of other events that we have been witnessing over the past number of years, whether it's a march, whether it's a gathering, whether it's a statement being made by people who are purported to be our leaders. This whole idea of what is appropriate transcends a lot of different venues and topics.
Oh, yeah. Again, it's tied into bias. If your instant reaction is, that's a dumb, you know, this guy Rankin doesn't know what he's talking about. It's not being appropriate. I love the show. It was great. Yeah, but you're still not really answering or digging deep into that question. It isn't about whether you like the show, you think they're great, what have you, or you don't. It's really not about, I don't think it's about that. Mm-hmm. I think the public discussion is really about, does this have a negative impact on anyone, especially kids?
Sure.
Now, the question comes, you know, and I'm fairly outspoken in my book, that a lot of advertising, we do not have truth in advertising in the US. A lot of advertising absolutely crosses the line, is manipulation, and as H.G. Wells said, is legalized lying. Then you have to look at that and question, again, is that appropriate?
Right.
I mean, if we are advertising, if soft drink manufacturers are spending $1 billion a year to advertise high-calorie soft drinks, which we know, you know, very, very unhealthy and lead to diabetes and stuff like that, or can, where do we stand on that?
Right.
And those are tough questions. I don't have the answer to that, but that's the debate. Those are the sorts of debates we should be having.
We should be having, most definitely, on that. Howard, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
Well, I have a sort of general website called drhowardjrankin.com. So that kind of summarizes a variety of different things that I do. If you're specifically interested in this cognitive bias stuff in the book, I think, therefore I'm wrong.com has some information about that. And occasionally I write blogs on that topic there. So that would be a good one. Of course, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. So you can find me there.
Fantastic.
So those are the places. Yeah.
Yeah. And we will provide links back to those sites on our show notes, as well as to a book page on Amazon. Dr. Howard Rankin, thank you so much for joining us on the Success Insight podcast. It was a delightful conversation. It's an opportunity to dive into topics that are near and dear to my heart, and actually not so much, it's not spin, but I think it's kind of helping me understand more about what it means to be, a critical thinker, and how do we learn how to ask questions and not settle for what somebody else thinks perhaps that's the right answer, because we have to learn how to question. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be talking with you and be on the show.
Fantastic. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Dr. Howard Rankin. He's the author of I Think, Therefore I Am Wrong, A Guide to Political Bias, Political Correctness, Fake News, and the Future of Mankind. We will provide links back to Howard's websites, his social sites, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and also we'll give you all a link back to his podcast site, How Not to Think, which is available on Buzzsprout, and then onto the ancillary podcast platforms like Spotify, iHeartRadio, etc. So I hope you all enjoyed today's podcast, and please do share your comments with us on our podcast website, successinsightpodcast.com, whether you find us there on our Facebook page, LinkedIn, Twitter, and also our ancillary pages for listening to your podcasts. So we hope you enjoyed today's show, and remember, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there and have a phenomenal day, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.